Okay. Okay, we're gonna get started. We're so appreciative that so many people um we are recording tonight's presentation, so thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 5th annual collaboration between Albany Public Library and the Adirondack Experience. This year's is our True Crime of the Adirondack series. I'm Megan Kelly from Albany Public Library. I'd like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that Albany Public Library is situated on the land of the Mohawk Haudenosaunee and the Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohicans. The Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in our two regions and practice their teachings and life ways. Over the next few months, we look forward to taking you down a path of intrigue, suspense, thrilling exploits, and villainous characters. Truly dark tales from the Adirondacks past. We start tonight with episode 1, Murder on Whiteface. Journalist Tim Rowland serves as this evening's gumshoe. Thank you, Tim. Having recently dug into the unsolved mystery of 2 Lake Placid guides killed while cutting a trail up Whiteface Mountain, Tim is an author, an outdoor writer whose work regularly appears in the Adirondack Explorer, Adirondack Life, and Cato's Regulation magazine. Earlier, he served as a columnist for the Herald Mail Media in Maryland, and before that, covered the state legislatures in Maryland and West Virginia. His books include High Peaks, A History of Adirondack Hiking from Noah to Neoprene, and Happy Lonesomes, A Guide to Remote Adirondack Hikes. His book, Strange and Obscure Stories of the Civil War, was a New York Times bestseller. So a bit of housekeeping for tonight. We have a record turnout. We have a lot of people here, and we're really excited you're here. We are thrilled you're all here. Please utilize the chat for comments during the talk and the Q&A feature for questions for Tim. We might not get to every question, but as long as it's in the chat or in the Q&A, we will be able to send you a response from Tim, who has graciously agreed to answer all the questions. So thank you so much, Tim. And let's get started. Thank you, Tim.
Well, thank you. And hello out there, and thank you all for patching in wherever you might be. And thank you to the Adirondack Experience and the Albany Public Library who are bringing you this program and also doing the technological heavy lifting. It's been 5 years now, and Zoom still feels weird to me because there's no audience, there's no feedback. You're just kind of in a bubble. And what it reminded me of when I remember when I was 4 years old, there was this TV show called Romper Room, and the host was this woman called Miss Sally, and she had a beehive hairdo and like this perpetually surprised look on her face, and she was supposed to be teaching us stuff, I guess. But at the end of the show, she had this, what she called like her magic looking glass, where she pretended to be able to see all the kids out there in TV land. And she'd say, I see Billy, and I see Susie, and I see Danny. And I'm 4 years old, and I know this lady isn't seeing squat. She's just sitting there by herself. But at the time, I had no appreciation for just how difficult that was. But now I do know. And I know one other thing, Miss Sally would really have killed it on Zoom. But tonight I may not be able to match her in composure, but I do like to think that I have better subject matter. And that's because we're here this evening to discuss 2 murders on Whiteface. They occurred in 1924 when George Martin and Jesse Crowningshield, 2 Adirondack guides, were killed while they were brushing out a hiking trail about halfway up the mountain. George was murdered with an axe, Jesse with a gun. The killer was never found. Now, when I was pitching this story to the Adirondack Explorer, like historians and journalists are trained not to sensationalize this. So, I just called it 2 Murders on Whiteface Mountain, which gets nobody's attention. And, if I didn't think to have a, gruesome catchphrase like they would have had on TV, something like, slaughter on the mountain or summit cleaver. So I know that 2 murders on Whiteface is pretty lame. Sounds like something you could get in a deli, right? Yeah, I'll have 2 murders on Whiteface and a Diet Coke. But I assure you, this is a heinous crime, one in which there are a lot more questions than there are answers. And I'm hoping that tonight you can help me solve some of these questions. Everyone here tonight gets to play detective. I'll be recounting the facts as we know them and raising some questions about the crime that don't seem to make sense. So if you have some answers, if you have some questions, if you have some theories, or if you think you know who the killer was, type it into the chat and we'll read and discuss as many as we have time for in the second half of the program. Crime by crowdsourcing. I'm kind of surprised the FBI hasn't thought of that. As a qualifier, I am not a professional historian. For most of my career, 30-some years, I was a political and humor columnist for a Maryland daily newspaper. And before I was a columnist, I was a state government reporter in Annapolis, Maryland. But before that, I spent about 6 months as a cop reporter for a small West Virginia daily. So obviously, I am highly qualified to write true crime stories. And the story that I'll be telling you tonight has been pieced together from a couple of public and private documents, but most everything we know about this crime comes from newspaper accounts. And these stories can have some pretty wild discrepancies from one newspaper to the next. So they're an imperfect vehicle for us to be studying, but right now they're all we've got. I also haven't had an answer yet from the police as to whether there might be any records that still exist. That very likely would add some clarity to the case if they do. And I should also say that cop reporting in 1980 and certainly in 1924 was very different than it is today. Police and reporters used to more or less be on the same team. And in my brief time on the cop beat, I'd ride the midnight shift with the police, and they took me to their shooting range. And in exchange, I wouldn't really ask too many questions about their tactics or make them look too bad in print. And that is why when the sheriff of Morgan County, West Virginia, forgot to lock the cell door back in 1980, and 2 inmates got out, broke into the bar across the street, true story, stole a keg of beer, brought it back to the jail, and had one big party for the whole cell block. That particular incident did not make it into the local Martinsburg Journal the next day. On the other hand, if there was a big story about to break, I'd usually be the one who got the tip first. So it was a relationship that was symbiotic and doesn't exist anymore, as now there's a more adversarial relationship between the two. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because crime stories that were written 100 years ago need to be read in a different light. It's very likely that reporters knew a lot more than they wrote, and that the police heavily influenced those stories that appeared in print. Almost universally, you'll read that the police in Lake Placid and Essex County were working themselves to the point of exhaustion on these Whiteface murders. There was never any criticism for failing to crack the case. No one was suggesting that they were doing anything wrong. This is a long way from John Benet Ramsey coverage. The newspapers cheered on the cops and said that the cops always said they're just this close to making an arrest. We got them now, boys. We just need one more break. But knowing what I know about police and reporters, I don't buy it. Reading between the lines, I don't think they were ever close to arresting anyone in this case. And that's part of what makes the case so interesting. It's also interesting because the Whiteface murders caused a sensation for about 6 weeks in 1924, and then strangely just dropped from public consciousness. So not only do we not know who committed the crime, we also don't know why it just seems to have evaporated from Adirondack lore and isn't remembered today. Now, today, unsolved murders as a general thing are common. About half of them in the country are unsolved. But if you go back 60 years, only about 16% didn't result in a conviction. It was very, very strange when you didn't have a case that was solved. What's changed? Well, for one thing, you're no longer allowed to beat the snot out of a subject until they confess. But another reason there are fewer convictions today is that people are less likely to cooperate with police because they just don't trust them or they don't want to be a snitch. And I think you'll see some of that bubbling up in the Whiteface murders. They either didn't trust the police, there was something going on there they didn't want them to know about, or there was someone there that they were trying to protect. One constant theme through all the newspaper stories is police saying that they're just needed one person in Wilmington to talk and they'd be able to make a case. And that one person never stepped forward. And if that's true, the question to think about is why? What would have caused an entire community to clam up in the face of such a terrifying case? So why wasn't it solved? And why didn't it make a bigger splash? Maybe the answers to those two questions are better explained when we think about what the Adirondacks were like in 1924. It was kind of between two eras. In the late 1800s, the railroads had finally come to the Adirondacks. You had grand hotels, you had great camps, you had throngs, you had Murray's Fools, you had a big rush of sportsmen and vacationers coming up from the cities. The Adirondacks were trendy then at the end of the 19th century. Then came the first decade of the 20th century, and some really catastrophic forest fires scorched tremendous amounts of forest land, burning just about everything that the loggers hadn't already destroyed. A lot of the Adirondacks would not have been particularly attractive places to visit. And by the teens, the automobile was coming on the scene. Tourists weren't tied to railroads, and they spread out instead of going to the same hotel that they had gone to every year of every summer for the past however many years. So this era of an urban playground is fading out, and the new era hadn't yet arrived, but it was coming. In 1924, the same year as the murders, Bob Marshall and his crew became the first to hike all 46 high peaks. A dozen years later, the 46ers of Troy was formed, and the first seeds of today's hiking boom were planted. So if you will, the Whiteface murders just kind of fell between the cracks of these two eras, and they never really made a mark on the local consciousness. I think that if they had happened 20 years before or 20 years later, they would have had a greater constituency and caused a more lasting sensation. Maybe not quite a movie, but at least a documentary by an experimental filmmaker from SUNY Plattsburgh. So here's how this story came back to life. I was writing a piece for the Adirondack Life last fall, the Adirondack Life magazine last fall, about a rather ridiculous proposal to the 1930s to build an 80-foot beacon on top of Whiteface Mountain. And to make the story more relevant, I needed an event, something that maybe had to do with the design of the beacon that happened 100 years ago in 1924. Because that's how things work in journalism. You know, journalism loves anniversaries. If you go up to an editor and say the Hindenburg blew up 97 years ago, they'll tell you to get lost. But if you tell them the Hindenburg blew up 100 years ago, they'll put a team on it and do a 5-part series. So to that end, I'm going back through old newspapers from 1924, and my keywords pinged on a story about plans for the Whiteface Memorial Highway. Great. But right on the same page with the highway story, I see a headline, 2 Adirondack guides murdered on Whiteface Mountain. Well, you can guess how I spent the rest of the night. I've read a lot of Adirondack history, and of course, being an outdoors writer, I'm familiar with a lot of hiking stories, and I'd never gotten a whiff of this. You know, guides, trails, high peaks. This is like the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost of the Adirondack hiking oeuvre. And you'd think there'd be maybe a shrine or a monument off in the woods, some mention of it, something. And I started doing more searches, and after a few hours, the story of what happened on the mountain that day started coming out of the fog. It was Friday, July 4th, 1924, when the two guides, George Martin and Jesse Crowningshield, went to work for a conservation group called the Shore Owners Association of Lake Placid to brush out a trail on Whiteface. Whiteface was privately owned up until the 1920s, so it seems possible the guides were improving an old herd path for public use, or maybe rerouting a trail to make it more hiker friendly now that it was likely to be getting more people from the public using that particular trail. I don't know much about the lives of the guides up until that point, although George seems to have been a longtime resident, while Jesse had lived down around Lake George and was a relative newcomer. They both lived in Lake Placid at the time. George was a 56-year-old bachelor who lived with his mom, and Jesse was a 34-year-old married father of 3, or 4, depending on which newspaper you read. By all accounts, they were well-liked and they were good friends. It appears they are working on the trail much as we know it today, which leaves Whiteface Landing on Lake Placid and follows Whiteface Brook for a ways as the route goes up the mountain. They packed themselves a lunch, 2 cans of beans and 2 loaves of bread, which they left along the side of the trail as they got to work. Then, late morning, there's a group of kids. When you're my age, everyone under 40 is a kid, from the Lake Placid Club, who had spent the night on the mountain and was coming back down the trail when someone spotted a pair of boots sticking out from beneath a pile of brush. One of the more imaginative writers for a newspaper had a young woman tripping over a pair of legs, so he gets credit for creativity. This is, of course, what was left of George Martin, the older of the 2 guides. His skull had been split open with an axe, and his right arm and shoulder were mangled, apparently while putting up a fight or trying to defend himself. The hikers raced down the mountain to get help, and with a few hours' time, the authorities had arrived back at the scene and were trying to put things together, such as they were. It didn't take long to figure out that Martin was one of 2 guides who were brushing out the trail that day, and it also didn't take long to figure out that his partner was missing. Also missing was Martin's watch and $30 that he had in his pocket. So suspicion immediately fell on Crowningshield, the motive being theft. 2 problems with that theory. One was that, as I mentioned, George and Jesse were pretty close, and it didn't make a lot of sense that he'd kill his friend over $30 at a watch. But the bigger problem with the theory was that the day after the killing, a fellow by the name of Abe Jutraw was fishing in Whiteface Brook when he saw an unusual shape upstream. And on investigation, it turned out to be Jesse, who had been shot to death with 4 bullets hitting him in a vertical line from his shoulder down to his thigh. One difficulty in trying to solve these crimes a century later is that some pretty wild inconsistencies appear in these newspaper accounts. In one story, Jesse was found the next day by the fishermen, 3/4 of a mile away from George. In another account, it was 3 days later that he was found, and Jesse was only 40 yards away. So those 2 sets of facts could obviously tell 2 radically different stories. So like I say, you kind of have to be flexible with your crime-solving skills here and believe the things that make more sense to you if 2 things are conflicting. For myself, I didn't have any immediate thoughts about what happened, but when I was describing it to my wife, Beth, she said, this is the 1920s. It had to be bootleggers, right? And I thought that was a good theory, and the brutality of it kind of fits. All you needed was a big motor car and pinstripe suits and a high-speed chase with Tommy guns. none of which we had. Instead, the police believed it played out like this. George was attacked by his assailant, and just as the killer was finishing the job, he was surprised by Jesse. So he chased Jesse back down the trail before shooting him, somewhere between 40 yards and 3/4 of a mile away. Then the killer dragged Jesse from the trail into the creek for some reason. A couple of other pieces of evidence turned up pretty fast. It didn't take them long to find the double-bladed axe that was the murder weapon. And a bit later, they found something more interesting. They found a bloody cap that was down on Wilmington Road, which today you would know as Route 86. The cap had initials stitched into the band, and those initials were, the police wouldn't say. But it had to be the killer's, right? I mean, you wouldn't take somebody else's bloody clothing away from a crime scene. You're not making a scrapbook. And the location of the cap is also interesting. If there are any hikers out here listening tonight, you might already know that in 1924, there's a trail from the site of the Whiteface Brook lean-to, more or less to where the guides were working on the trail, that runs east through what is called Sunshine Notch to High Falls Gorge on Route 86. The trail has since been abandoned, but in 1924, it would have been familiar not just to locals, but to vacationers, because the gorge was a tourist trap even back then, and would have made a fun destination for hikers who had boated across to Whiteface Landing, hiked up the Whiteface Trail, taken the Sunrise Notch Trail, over to the chasm. And if the killer took this trail out of the mountains in the direction of Wilmington, it would imply he had more ties to Wilmington than to Lake Placid. And as you'll see, police focused their investigation primarily on Wilmington, and I suspect this is why. But returning to the scene of the crime, there were some other obvious holes that need to be filled in. Here's a big one to me. If the murderer had a gun, why didn't he use it to kill George? I don't know how murderers think. I mean, let's see, gun, axe. What's it going to be? That I could use the exercise. I'm going with the axe. And further down the mountain, there's another problem. The first 3 bullets that hit Jesse were shot from a .32 caliber pistol, but the 4th was shot from a .38. 2 different guns. 2 different guns. So you immediately think 2 guns, 2 killers. And maybe that's true, but through the course of this investigation, the police really don't seem to think of it that way. The articles you read, they talk about the killer in singular tense. The theories they turn out all involve one person. There's not a group, not 2. They all think that one person was responsible for this act. So this, if you think that way, this is what the evidence shows. The killer is walking down the trail, encounters an old man clearing brush. He puts down his guns, picks up an axe, and brings it down on George's dome. Then comes a younger guide, so he puts down the axe and picks up his guns, chases Jesse down the mountain, shoots him 3 times with one pistol, then pulls out a second pistol, shoots him one more time, drags him into the brook, returns to the crime scene, and takes George's bloody cap and trots out to Route 86. On what planet does that make sense? And as if this isn't enough, there's more to consider. The killer stole George's money and valuables, but not Jesse's. However, he did steal the guys' beans and their bread. He took their lunch. This is what authorities are facing when they arrive on the scene. Just this real hodgepodge of many facts pointing in many different directions. They probably figured to make pretty fast work of it, but things got bogged down almost immediately. They started with 10 officers fanning across the mountain, And within days, they had more than 100 people involved in the search. Local people were helping. Wealthy vacationers and club members were helping. They brought in bloodhounds, but it was raining by that time, so that didn't help things out much. There were about 150 campers on Lake Placid for the holiday weekend at the time. And the prosecutor who was leading the investigation interviewed, he said, every single one of them. He told the papers, "Our object in this census is to learn who, if anyone, left the camp around July 4 and to record the character and reputation of each camper. If any camper has left the lake, we are going to locate him and question him." Sympathetic reporters or not, the police really did seem to be doing all they could. The plainclothes troopers infiltrated bars and restaurants around Wilmington, hoping somebody would spill the beans. They brought in Pinkerton detectives to help. The Glen Falls paper reported that every trail is being watched. Authorities are working day and night in an effort to unravel the mystery which surrounds the double murder. The Essex County supervisors even called a special meeting and ordered, in today's money, a $100,000 reward for information that would lead to an arrest. And if you know the Essex County supervisors, even today, I mean, God love them, but they are about the biggest bunch of penny pinchers you have ever seen. To put it in perspective, that reward was about twice as much as the reward the FBI offered for information leading to the arrest of the United Health killer. This is probably more money than the county had, but I think it shows the level of fear and desperation in the community that summer that the supervisors would offer up such a substantial sum. So who did it? Let me give you a list of theories that were mentioned at one time or another. It was over a woman. One paper even said, "Cherchez la femme." Classic. This is a pretty standard fallback, okay? Depending on the way you measure it, the FBI says about 55% of homicides have some romantic angle to them. And now the newspaper accounts never got more specific than a woman. I assume this meant some kind of love triangle, but that it wasn't that the woman was the one who was doing the killing, but who knows? Then they suggested it might be a single case of robbery gone bad. Sounds plausible, but the theory, though, is complicated by the fact that Jesse's valuables weren't taken. And also on the mountain that day, there are a fair number of presumably wealthy club members who might have provided the thief with a few more tempting targets than a couple of blue-collar trail workers would have. Next up, we have the work of a maniac. At the time, there were reports of a man who was in the habit of stalking about Whiteface Mountain, acting weird and talking to himself, which at that point in history probably would have described about half the people in the Adirondacks. Matter of fact, it was a bad time to be a psycho in the Adirondacks because pretty much all of them were rounded up and questioned, and at least one, even though he had no connection with the crime whatsoever, was committed to the insane asylum in Ogdensburg as a result. Another theory was that this was an act of revenge. An enemy who had a grudge against one of the two men. And they went so far as identifying him as a character in the North. And this character in the North was said to have made threats and was going to do violence against one or the other. But if there were a character in the North, he was either never found or never questioned, and there was never any indication that anything came of this particular lead. And finally, they thought it might be a copycat crime. You know, this is a violent decade, and when in Rome, I thought copycat crime was kind of a modern phenomenon, but apparently not. So it was interesting to me that they were talking about copycat crimes way back in the 1920s. So police thought they got a big break when they found a group of teenagers who had taken a motorboat to Whiteface Landing on July 4th, the morning of July 4th, hiked the Whiteface Trail and then the Sunrise Notch Trail, which they followed to High Falls Gorge that morning. So that means they would have been hiking the same trail at the same time as the killer. But on questioning, none of them had seen anything either. We do get a sense of the guides, I think, from the reaction of the community, which suggested they were well thought of, they were esteemed members of the community. You know, first there was this outlandish reward for the capture of the person, for the capture of the killer. You saw the tremendous amount of people who helped with the search, and the village paid for the funerals of the two men and started a fund to help the dependents. Even so, it fell out of the public eye pretty fast. By the end of July, there simply wasn't anything left to report, and the articles dried up. The story was briefly revisited in November of that year when a newspaper wrote, quote, "Of all the mysterious deaths that have occurred in the Adirondacks, none have been more baffling to authorities than the brutal murder of two trail cutters, Jesse Cunningham and George Martin, the disappearance of Leighton Goodell of Buffalo, and the shooting of Frank Bray." Wait, what? There were a couple other strange happenings in the North Country that summer and fall, including the disappearance of Leighton, who went into the woods at the hunting party to the north in Loon Lake and was never seen again, and the death of Bray, a guide who was shot to death near Blue Mountain Lake, even though none of the weapons in possession of his hunting party had been fired. So maybe there was a psycho roaming the Adirondack Mountains in the summer and fall of 1924. You read the paper and you can kind of sense that the writer was kind of rooting for that, but even he seemed to think that it was a little bit dubious. So none of these interviews were going anywhere. No suspect stayed a suspect for very long. Every lead ended in disappointment. The Ticonderoga Sentinel, this is my favorite, said, "Solutions seem close at hand at times, and then, like a will-o'-the-wisp, hope faded. The late Lieutenant Dutch Gorenflow came close to an answer to the grim riddle." And this would have been a fantastic place for the paper to have elaborated on that statement, but the article never did. It just ended right there. So I looked up the trooper and found that Herman Dutch Gorenflow was a state trooper who seemed to be the one guy who was not going to give up. And he might have been the one that could have finally brought this thing in. But then 2 years later, he got sick with a mysterious illness and died undergoing an emergency operation at the age of 35. The story was that some conscience-riddled soul was about to spill his guts, but would only talk to Gorenflow, nobody else. And then Gorenflow was gone and the informant melted into oblivion. You know, you talk about different eras, and can you even begin to imagine if this had happened in the age of social media? You know, lead investigator in double homicide dies at age 35 of mysterious illness. I don't even want to think about it. There's one more suspect whose name came up not long after the killing, and that was the name of William King. And my wife would say, "I told you so," because William King was a bootlegger, or a bootlegger of sorts, I guess you would say. He was what in the days of Prohibition they called a highway jacker or a hijacker. In New York, hijackers would ambush bootleggers who had done all the work of hauling liquor down from Canada. The hijackers would commandeer the booze and sell it on the black market after killing off all the bootlegger employees and keeping the profits for themselves without having done any of the work. So they were kind of the private equity component of Prohibition, as I understand it. Highwaymen were particularly violent, and in the fall of 1923, King and two accomplices had gotten into a shootout with police south of Glens Falls, and the shootout killed a 27-year-old trooper and World War I veteran by the name of Roy Donovan. Police called in backup and chased the three hoodlums south, and they finally captured the three hijackers, but when they threw the door to the car open, there was no trace of King. The two accomplices were unable to add any clarity as to how King vanished or to where. They said they would have been happy to help, but they were drunk. And King only appears 3 more times in history. One was 5 years later when his wife filed for divorce, and her lawyers contended that he had probably been hit in the shootout and kind of crawled out of the car off into the woods and died and was never found. But the second time King's name came up was 9 months after he disappeared and several days after the Whiteface murders. An engineer for General Electric from Schenectady was hiking near the Adirondack Lodge 10 miles south of Whiteface a few days after the murders when he reported seeing a person who matched King's description. This was Schenectady. This King was down in his neck of the woods, so he would have been more familiar with this person and probably saw posters and knew something of what he looked like. The fellow, whoever he was alone and disheveled and looked as if he'd been a long time in the woods. He asked the engineer if he had any spare clothing. The Glens Falls paper put it this way: authorities believe it probable that King had been hiding for some time, and desperate, perhaps, for the want of food, he had attempted to steal provisions from the 2 kits of the guides, that he had killed Martin when discovered, and that later Crowningshield had come upon him, and he had killed him to cover up the slaying of Martin. We know King was violent, that he had a lot of guns. He might have been in need of a couple cans of beans. Did he know about Adirondack trails? Possible. You know, the bootleggers would sit on top of Poco Moonshine Mountain, fittingly enough, and signal down to Route 9 when the coast was clear. So the Adirondack Mountains were known to them. Another long shot, I would call it, but, you know, maybe. To me, though, it does clear up one part of the mystery. Remember the bloody cap with the initials? Police wouldn't say whether it belonged to the killer or one of the guides. And yet they seemed to treat this William King lead legitimately. They said he was a legitimate suspect. So unless all the other suspects they'd questioned up until that time had the initials WK, which I don't think they did, I think we can safely assume the initials in that hat had belonged to one of the guides. As to why you would take a bloody cap that didn't belong to him, you know, maybe it wasn't bloody when he took it. The killer very well might have been injured himself in the fight with George and needed a bandage. But like everything else in this case, it's just a guess at this point. There is one last tantalizing and confounding detail that I'll leave you with. In 1938, 14 years after the murders, the Saratoga prosecutor announced he was reopening the case of William King and Roy Donovan. This caused quite a stir in the community, as you can imagine, and so there were lines of reporters with their big cameras, the flash bulbs and everything, lined up outside the courthouse on grand jury day. But when the prosecutor came out of the grand jury room, he tersely said he would have nothing to report about Donovan or King, and that he wouldn't at any point in the future either. Oh well. So that's what I know about the case. And now I will pitch it back to Megan, and we can hear what you think. Anything you would like to bounce off me, I'll be sticking around and we can talk about this some more. Megan, do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, we've had a lot of questions and comments in the chat, so thank you so much. I'll just read a few questions. So Jay asked, what type of gun was used at Blue Mountain? Do you happen to know?
The Blue Mountain, I believe, would have been a hunting rifle, since
Okay.
they were out deer hunting.
And Rebecca asked, how do they know he had $30 on him?
I wondered that too. If possibly from his wife, but it was very exact in the amount of money that he had.
Yeah. And the similar kind of question Marianne asked, how they knew what they took for lunch and how they knew that the killer took the food.
I guess there's no direct, it could have been a squirrel, I suppose, with a squirrel with a can opener. But they seem to be pretty sure that the lunch was in the police accounts that the lunch was taken by the killers. And they
Okay.
seem pretty emphatic that Jesse still had his belongings. As to how they knew what it was, perhaps they were given rations by the Shore Owners Association before they were sent up the mountain. But again, we're guessing. So
Yeah. Yeah. We got a question from Carrie just now. Has anyone done a criminal profile of the killers?
they have not that I know of. And that's what, if we could determine whether or not there are police records, that would, certainly clear up a lot of things. The character in the North, presumably, if they knew who he was, he'd be named, and you could
Mhm.
start putting faces and identities and habits with these people.
We got a question from Barry. Do we know which of the two victims died first or how far
Very good
apart in
question.
times of death they
Yeah,
were?
very good question. The every single newspaper says that George was killed first, and maybe, but I don't think there's anything definitive that said they couldn't have killed Jesse first and then gone back up the hill and killed George. So that's a very good question. Good question.
Barry also asked, no one heard any gunshots?
No, this would that you wouldn't necessarily out on, a big mountain like this. It would take a pretty big coincidence for yeah, these are relatively, kind of small caliber guns, and they're not gonna be like a rifle that'll echo across the canyons. So it's not surprising that no one would have heard the guns, but again, if you were going to shoot someone, maybe the reason he used an axe instead of a gun is he was worried that someone would come along at just the wrong time.
So we also, I'm gonna see, we got a theory from Lisa.
Good.
So here's a theory. George's murder was personal and the perpetrator by a jealous man or woman, possibly. They hoped to kill George and flee, but Jesse came along. The murderer picked up George's gun and shot at Jesse. The murderer possibly took the cap in order to frame someone else, but dropped it along the way.
I see some nodding from my better half over here, so I think this theory has some traction in this household.
Mhm. Okay.
Yeah, I forget. I looked up the number, the percentage of murders that involve people who, basically know the person they are murdering, and it's very, very high. It's random murders are relatively rare, and so just reading this over, my personal opinion is that they knew these, the assailant knew the victim somehow.
So we got a question from Cheryl. Do you think the kids who found the dead men were involved or took the lunches, or they took the money and didn't take, since he wasn't found till the next day or two? So I think that Jesse wasn't found till later.
Here's what's interesting about that. There are reports about all the campers being searched. He's interviewing all of these the campers, which of course are the, probably not the same social status as someone from Lake Placid Club. Uh, Nowhere did I see anyone from any of the what you might call the elite hostelries or clubs in Lake Placid. Nowhere did I see that they were questioned. The two times they come up are that the yeah, I think the Lake Placid Club, and that sounds like the Shore Owners Association, did participate in the search of, they sounded sincere in trying to find the killers. There's no hint that, and again, somebody at the Lake Placid Club, what would $30 mean to them? I don't know, but of course, kids do some wild things, so you don't know on that front.
Kathy asked also in the Q&A, $30 back then would have been a huge amount to carry in those days in the woods.
Yeah,
Suspicious. What
I
is
should
the
have figured that
equivalent?
out. Yeah, yeah.
So actually, Cheryl from Adirondacks, that would be $550 today. So it would be quite a sum of money.
Yeah, that seems odd to take that amount of cash
Mhm.
up on the mountain with you.
Uh, Allie asked, do we know if the axe had any markings making it known property of the two victims?
The
Could it be
implication
theirs?
is that it was, if not property of the trail cutters, it was property of the association. The only document that we've been able to find from the association was like uh, it was like a centennial recap of the history of the association. And it doesn't make any mention of the killings, and maybe I mean, you can't really say, July 4th, 400 people showed up for our picnic, 2 guides slaughtered. Phil Sokolowski caught a 48-inch lake trout. It's just it may not have a place in a retrospective like that. It's
Mhm.
the people who wrote it may have felt.
Question from Melissa. Do they still have the cap, and have they ever analyzed it for DNA?
Yeah, that's something that depends on whether they still have the files, whether the police still have the files. The last request I made was, and this case came to light, I guess, about October, and so it was kind of right before the holidays when I sent out a request, and it's not a rapid response group under the best of circumstances, but they probably do need to get a little more chance to see what they have.
Uh, Faith proposed perhaps Jesse was killed first and the killer ditched the guns and used George's axe to kill George.
Yeah, this, and it's the contrarian in me, I guess, but just every account saying that George was killed first. I don't see necessarily any evidence for that. I mean, I guess it kind of fits, but again, it depends on whether, um, if Jesse were only 40 yards away and not 3/4 of a mile, that's a whole different situation. That's the whole thing playing out right in a very small amount of space, as opposed to,
Mhm.
somebody surprising someone, turning around and hauling down the trail. And even then, it's hard to believe they'd get 3/4 of a mile. But yeah, I think that's for those of you who have said who was killed first, congratulations in my eyes, because I thought that was one of the things that one of the first questions that seemed kind of funny to me, that it wasn't any more that it wasn't more strongly investigated than that.
Alex asked if you could tell us more about the suspect Richard Happy and Jack Madison. If I said that name right, Madison, like Matson. That sound.
Um,
We can move on.
how are they spelled?
Richard Happy, like Happy, and Jack Mattion.
No, I don't recall those
Um,
names. Doesn't mean they're not mentioned in one of the news stories that I didn't see. So
okay. Bernie asked, with the Olympics coming in, was it someone maybe against the development of the mountain or the two towns in Lake Placid and Wilmington?
I wondered if there was some kind of Lake Placid Wilmington tension. I don't know about the Olympics. That's a good point. I hadn't really thought that the build up to the Olympics was happening. Uh, but it seemed like there was something that Wilmington wanted to keep quiet. And I have a thought about what that might be, but nothing concrete.
Barry also asked, are you thinking it could be like a business deal gone awry?
Okay, I'll get into my harebrained theory. The I mentioned that the mountain was private up until just about that time and was starting to be opened up. And when it was private, who knows what was going on. And the streams up there, some of those crevices, this is during Prohibition, just seems like it might have been ripe for moonshining. And looking at the crime scene as I look at it, it's really hard for me to, no matter what the police say, it's really hard for me to believe that just one person uh, had an axe, had two guns, was able to create all this mayhem without a lot of luck, I would say. And so I wonder if, perhaps on rerouting a trail, that Jesse and George didn't stumble across something that they weren't supposed to stumble across, that they ran into kind of a localized gang, to me, it almost looks like there need to be like 3 or 4 people that were the assailants. And perhaps that explains the uh, Wilmington's reluctance to become involved. And if it were their people and their families, there may have been just this, as the person was referring to, a little bit of this Whiteface, or I'm sorry, Lake Placid, Wilmington tension that we're not going to sell our guys out to Lake Placid. So that's probably just totally bogus. But you're sitting around sometimes going, what could have happened? Yeah. Come with some
Well,
weird.
that someone also asked, do you think that the two trail markers could have come across an illegal operation of some sort? So that kind of.
Yeah, that would be, if they did, I suspect that might be what it was.
Were any of the present day Adirondack historians, such as John Sasso, able to contribute any information?
No, and that was what was, I ran it past John, I ran it past Tony Goodwin, I ran it past Wilmington Historical Society. Uh, One of the Wilmington, or a couple of the Wilmington Historical Society people had heard of it, didn't know a lot of the details. And so John was working on another project. But if you know Tony, when there's a case like this that comes along and you dangle it in front of his nose, that's like catnip to him. So he tried for a few days not to react, but then he was just going down the same rabbit holes that I was going down. He did find 2 interesting things. One was he came across the shore owners centennial, and he came across, I believe, someone by the name of Crowningshield, that a descendant that still lives in this area, that again was vaguely familiar with the case. But that's a good question, because that's really kind of what, for usually the way this thing works is, I started to write a book one time called Untold Stories of the Civil War. Well, there are no untold stories of the Civil War, and every historian uh, advised me of that fact in no uncertain terms. So I changed the name. But there are very few historical events that are not known in this particular area, and so that's what kind of piqued my interest about this, is just how it could have become lost.
Mike asked, so they wanted to know what month it was in 1924. Mike delivers fuel oil truck on the ice on Lake Placid. So if the ice hadn't yet gone out, was there an escape route available?
Um, yeah, I see where he's going with this. This would have been July, so I think
Okay.
and they talked about a motorboat accessing
Mhm.
the dock. But one thing and maybe somebody that's listening can help me with this, but I don't know why there's another trail, of course, the Connery Pond Trail that comes off of 86, and I don't know whether that trail existed in 1924. If it did, then when they found this cap on Route 86, well, conceivably the killer could have taken a different route out of the mountains than what everyone's assuming, or at least what I'm assuming that he did.
So John asks, is there any items found in a museum someplace? Guessing items from the murder scene.
I don't think so. And that's why, it'd be nice to find a police locker someplace that had a double-bladed axe and yeah, a couple cans of beans, just yeah, just some
Mhm.
artifacts of. But no, as far as I know, there's nothing that survived.
Susan asked, have you been able to follow up with any relatives of the two deceased?
That was the other thing that Tony Goodwin found. He found that
Mhm.
a couple, someone by the name of Crowningshield, and he followed up with them and was interested and knew that he had heard stories about his relative, but there was really nothing else handed down, nothing else concrete.
Tommy asked, what's the theory on the two different caliber shells?
Boy, that's the question. And that is, to me, that really makes it hard to think that it was just one person because if you want to think you had a 38 with three bullets in it and you shot all three and then you exhausted that and you had to get another one. The other kind of odd thing is that it seems to me that the three shots from the 38 uh did the damage, and so the last shot from the 36 was really kind of superfluous. So to me it suggests two people, but I don't know what people are in the habit of doing. Maybe it was like the Wild West where they had two holsters on their gun belt and a pistol in each.
So I think we'll do two or three more questions. Oh, let's see. I'm just gonna take a look through here. So Isabella says, I think the killer thought they hurt Jesse enough to leave him to bleed out and then killed George and then left Jesse. That's why they said Jesse died first. So that's a thought from Isabella.
Possible.
Let's see over here because we had some questions in the chat too. Um, so Beth asked, is it possible that the guns belong to the victims and the killer ambushed them?
Oh, that's a good one. I had not thought of that. Yeah, they seem to have a pretty good inventory of what tools and what was in the pockets of the guides. So I would think that they probably would have known if the guides had the guns, uh, but that's the kind of thinking we need to stuff that hadn't been thought about yet.
Catherine said, seems very plausible that there there was some sort of cover up with people in high places, um, or people of influence killed the story.
Yeah, I think that's possible, and I also think that if you had three or four Wilmington families and these are extended families, they had tentacles all over the place, that there could have been something that was some sort of activity that no one wanted to see come out in the open. And if it were particularly rough groups, you can look at it two ways. It could either be like the elites that crush it from above, or it could be these riffraff from down below that are just really seedy characters, and no one wants to take the risk of getting on their bad side.
Yeah. Marianne asked, was Jesse shot in the front or the back?
He was shot in the back. He was shot once in the, if I remember this right, once in the ear, once in the shoulder, once in the kidney, and then once in the thigh. But it's kind of, okay, I'll bring, this is another one. It was like pop, 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 and then the next gun was just, you didn't miss a beat. It was kind of straight in that straight line. I guess, just coincidence.
Wow.
So.
Okay, here's Cheryl.
Hello, here's Cheryl to go ahead and wrap this all up. So I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. What a fun and exciting and mysterious, and I love all the theories. And I really want to thank Megan for handling all the Q&A and the chats and the ideas. And Tim, this was just delightful. What a fun evening you've taken us down. I'm Cheryl Bronstein. I am the Director of Interpretation at the Adirondack Experience. So we hope you enjoyed this first episode in our true crime of the Adirondacks partnership with Albany Public Library. You're not going to want to miss the next program in this series. It will feature author Michael Benson, who's going to be talking about the 2015 escape from Dannemora that obviously gripped the nation for quite a while. And Michael's book inspired a Showtime limited series about that story. So that will be on February 12th. We'll have information on how to register for that in the chat. Hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next month for more true crime of the Adirondacks. Thanks, everybody. Good night.